I fundamentally believe that we need to discover a new path forward, thinking of our spaces as health generating systems, placemaking as an accelerant for our biological, physiological, and our physical health, meaning that it's not what architecture is, but in fact, what architecture does to change all of these systems as a health generating system.
Welcome to the Felt Experience podcast, where we discuss with some of the world's leaders and advocates how the physical environments of where we live, work, and are educated can profoundly impact our physical, psychological, and emotional health and well-being. I'm Melissa Henschke, founder and director of Archetypes of Interiority. Welcome to the Felt Experience. In today's episode, we will explore Tye Farrow's book on constructing health. Constructing Health is a compelling book about how the built environment enhances your mind's health. It explores the relationship between placemaking, mind health, and human performance at the intersection of neuroscience and architecture. Tye Farrow is a world-recognised pioneer tackling how what we create either gives or causes health. With award-winning projects around the globe that enact salutogenic design that actively incites health, he is the first Canadian architect to have earned a Master of Neuroscience Applied to Architecture and has a Master of Architecture in Urban Design, Harvard University, and a Bachelor of Architecture degree, University of Toronto. Tye is a sought-after speaker who has presented to respected organisations and universities in over 40 cities on 6 continents, including the Salk Institute, the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, Mayo Clinic, and the Cleveland Clinic, and has been called a global leader making a significant contribution to health and humanity through the medium of architecture, and one of the world's most prominent practitioners of and advocates for human-built environments. Tye, what is constructing health, and why is this topic so important to you?
Constructing health is trying to make the intersection of architecture and neuroscience more accessible. And it's a book of 80,000 words. It's 300 pages and lots of over 400 images and diagrams. But what it begins to do, I think, for architects and designers and people in the cognitive sciences, is it begins to explore what causes health. What if health was the basis of judging every public space and every building we create? And what if we stop tolerating designs that cause boredom and dis-ease? And I'm using that word very specifically, and certainly depression, which we discovered through COVID. And how do buildings make us feel? But more importantly, how do they make us feel better? And it's in the context that historically our attitudes towards health, have been very holistic and salutogenic, really meaning focusing on the origins and the causes of our mental, physical, and societal health. And architecture has always followed suit. But recently, however, and certainly through our sort of Western evidence-based medical view, we've embraced sort of the idea of pathogens, what causes disease, and the question is why. And what the book begins to ask and get into is, can we actually construct health? And so the book explores the science and that intersection between neuroscience and architecture, and explores how our mind and our sensory system interact with our environment around us, and specifically our built environment, to see what enhances or harms our health and well-being. And that, as we know that while our biological brain is housed in our skull, research is showing that, in fact, our mind, which is the brain's operating system, in a simple way, it extends through and beyond our body to engage with our surroundings. And it, I believe, raises very important questions for the role of architecture and placemaking and what it does to actively cause and create mind health. And so, what the book is trying to do is to bridge the gap in knowledge between really our therapeutic medical world and our design communities, which often are very separate, to reveal how we can intentionally shape our environments so that they support our physical, neurological health and well-being. And it specifically gets into recent discoveries in cognitive psychology, which is really the science of the mind, and neuroscience, which is really the science of the brain. So really that operating system and the physical organ itself, the brain, and to really look at how we form relationships with our environment, and that idea of salutogenic, health-causing relationships, because the way our mind forms relationships, person to place, is very similar to the way we form enriching person-to-person relationships. The characters and qualities are very, very similar, and it begins to dive into this area that really fascinates me, which is called environmental enrichment. We can probably get into that in a minute because I think it's significant. But importantly, what the book is trying to do, I did a Master of Neuroscience Applied to Architecture and Design, the first Canadian architect with that degree, when in fact the program was in its second year of operation. And there was nothing to go to as sort of a textbook. And so the book's trying to offer a really engaging and accessible way forward that either architects and designers or cognitive scientists that are students, or us as professionals, or in fact the general public, just as a coffee table book, it can begin to give people the tools, because once we see these things, once we read and see about them, you can't unsee them. And that's really the most important thing about what the book's trying to do, because I think it's a new path forward for us.
Awesome. The consciousness of constructing health. I love it. Throughout your book, you make continued reference to salutogenic design. Firstly, what is it and how do you include it in your work?
Salutogenesis is a very complicated word. It doesn't roll easily off
doesn't
one's
roll off
tongue.
my tongue very well either.
Well, you're not the only one. And so the idea, well, let me step back first of all and say that the word pathogens or pathogenics, we know that word very well. And if I'm, giving a talk and, there's a crowd of a couple hundred people, I say, okay, put up your hand if you know what pathogens are. And everybody puts up their hand and said, yes, of course. And then I say, well, how many people know what salutogenesis is? And nobody puts their hand up, or very few. So pathogens or pathogenic, it comes from the Latin and the Greek words of patho and genesis, meaning patho is disease and genesis is the origins. And so what it relates to is the origins of disease, what causes disease. And we know we have health preventative methods out there and health prevention initiatives. And I think that's kind of crazy. It's sort of like stopping health. And shouldn't we reframe it as disease prevention things? But The opposite of that is salutogenesis, coming from the Latin and the Greek words again, of solace, the Greek god of health, and genesis. So what it really is how, in my words, how can we cause health? How can we sort of do the positive side as opposed to stopping something bad? And it comes from a guy called Aaron Atanovsky in the 1970s. He's an Israeli American medical doctor and sociologist. And he studied people to see why, when going under very terrible or through very terrible things in their lives, why is it they didn't have all of the health problems, but in fact they had a frame of mind that led them forward? And some of the people that he studied were people that went through the Holocaust. And so hard to think of something, worse that you could go through. And if these people lived and survived, which they did through it, he was looking at why that happened. And he got into this idea, or he framed it around this idea of a sense of coherence. Arguably, you could call it a sense of purpose, meaning that these individuals, they're feeling that one's internal and external environments are predictable. And he buttressed, and that's sort of a sense of purpose, the way I frame it. And he buttressed, or he supported this concept around really three ideas, which is comprehensibility, manageability, and meaningfulness. What does that mean? Well, comprehensibility is really that perception that events, or in fact places that you're in, are understandable, orderly, and your part in it. So what does that mean? Well, comprehensibility, simply think of walking up to a building, and is the front door clear on how you get into the building? Yeah. Once you get into the building, can you navigate through it in an orderly way? Well, certainly.
It seems so simple.
It does, but a lot of environments we go into, it's like, where the hell is the front door? And then once you get into it, it's impossible to navigate your way through. Manageability, that gets into sort of that finding your way through. And it's also, it's defined as really the resources at your disposal can they be used to meet really the requirements, either events that face you, or in fact the places around you. And the one that's really, really important, the third piece for me, is this idea of meaningfulness. And there's a motivational dimension, meaning that life has purpose. And you think of that idea, why aren't we going back to the office anymore? Why do we want to stay at home? Well, in fact, it's the comprehensibility, manageability, and the meaningfulness that a lot of these environments, our work environments, they don't have that motivational dimension. And they're the worst place you want to be because they don't offer that extra spring in your step. And so this idea of salutogenesis, what causes health, and in fact, can we construct health? It's very, very important for me, and they are really the key pieces that we use in viewing all design decisions we take. And just stepping back a little bit from that, this idea that, as I lay out in my book, that, for 3,000 years of human history, I mean, you're based in Australia, and if you look at, the Aboriginal view, Indigenous view of health and well-being, where you look at place, country, the land that you're on, the comprehensibility, manageability, and meaningfulness is very much rooted in what I would call my view of a salutogenic view of health.
Totally.
But for the last 100 years, we've had a very pathogenic view. And how do I support that? Well, medical researchers have identified 8,000 in the last 100 years. They've identified 8,000 known causes or symptoms of disease. But they've only identified 80 known causes or symptoms of health. And what's clear is we find what we look for. And we have to step, I think, away from just the last 100 years and, in fact, embrace some of these indigenous and Aboriginal or traditional Chinese or all of these other views of health and well-being that we've had for thousands of years, which we are beginning to rediscover and bring them back into our view and move away from this sort of transactional view of health and well-being. And transactional, what do I mean by that? Or what's an example of it? Well, our buildings, I think we view them as very transactional. What do I mean by that? They need to be functional. Well, of course they do. And what's another example of it? Think of a simple hamburger. So a hamburger, in fact, is very transactional. What do I mean by that? Well, it's functional, like the buildings were asked, meaning that you don't need a plate or a knife and a fork to consume it. And in fact, it's very functional also because it does its job. It gives you protein. But the important part, meaning that it's transactional, like a lot of our buildings is, that you consume it, it gives you the protein, but it leaves you feeling empty after an hour. That empty spot in your stomach. And in fact, it also does damage to you, the hamburger does, because of all the additives and all the stuff that's put into it, that in fact, it damages your physiology and in fact, your psychology. And that's in fact what our environments do also.
And that sense of, buildings need to give us a sense of belonging and connection.
That's the meaningfulness.
And the same as food. We need to know where it comes from to have the connection.
Well, that's right. That it actually damages your body, and it's important to realize that there's no such thing as neutral space. There's no space that sits in the middle and doesn't change our mind and our body, and that's because our as I was mentioning that our brain is housed in our skull, but our mind is embodied. And what does embodied mean? That, well, it's all our sensory systems that go to our interoceptive and proprioceptive and exteroceptive systems, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic systems. And our body, as a result, is like a radar dish, meaning that there's 11 million bits of information that is fed to our body that are sympathetic and sympathetic systems registered. But in fact, that there's only 50 bits of information per second that registers with us from a conscious standpoint. But the subconscious, the preconscious, all of those things still registers that 11 million bits of information that are coming to us. And so we need to think of the spaces we create as non-invasive therapeutic treatments that feeds all of our systems, like those smoothies we have in the mornings compared to the hamburger that does all of the wonderful things to all of our systems. And so I fundamentally believe that we need to discover a new path forward, thinking of our spaces as health-generating systems, placemaking as an accelerant for our biological, physiological, and our physical health, meaning that it's not what architecture is, but in fact, what architecture does to change all of these systems as a health-generating system.
What has been your most impactful project to date and why?
Well, I think one that we've just opened in the ancient city of Jerusalem, that's one of the 10 oldest cities in the world. We just opened a cancer center that is starting to be called a butterfly. And it's the largest mass timber building in the area. When you approach it, it has plazas and gardens, a lovely little cafe where people, it's a cancer center, but people that either work in the wider area, in the community, they don't have cancer, or people that do have cancer or their families, or in fact, the staff that are working there, they're coming there to gather and to sit. And in fact, the feedback from the CEO, two factors that are very, very important to me is that people that have gone through cancer have succeeded in stopping cancer, or in fact, the families that have lost people in their cancer journey. The CEO tells me that they're asking permission, can they come and just spend time in this place after you've finished cancer treatment, or you've lost somebody, or in fact, you're just in the community, that people want to come and spend time there because it seems to move them. That I think is very important in these healing environments, that in fact, the hospitals are the last places that we want to go to. But in fact, that is beginning to change. The second important statistic for me is that all around the world, and we're working throughout Europe to Israel, hopefully soon in Australia, with some opportunities there that we're very excited about, in all hospital environments, is that they have empty positions. There's about 30%, varying between 15 to 30% of all positions in hospitals now, post-COVID, that they have empty positions that they can't fill. That's a real problem. And in fact, there's parallels also about not going back to the office to work. We're now seeing it in hospital environments. And in fact, that's the same in recently opened either hospitals or cancer centers in Jerusalem, or in fact in Israel. But the CEO of the hospital tells me that in fact, there is a lineup of people that want to work in this building. That
says a lot,
as he describes to me, because people are feeling a very deep connections. And we've designed the building specifically, as I lay out in the book, on how we can create enriched environments, water enriched environments. It's an area of study that is very important to us. And in the 1940s, a researcher, a doctor, a scientist, he had lab mice, lab in those cages in bright lights. And he brought some of those home and he put them into what he calls an enriched environment. And that's where they can climb around on different things and go through tubes. And he discovered that the mice that were in these enriched environments, after a very short period, were happier, they were socially more active, they seemed healthier, and they were better at solving problems in a fairly short period. This research continues on environmental enrichment. In the 1960s, a very interesting lady for me called Diamond, University of California, Berkeley, and she repeats this experiment. What does she do? She has some mice that are in the regular lab cage, which were called an impoverished environment. She puts some mice in a regular cage, which is, just with a running wheel that we usually see. And then she puts some in this enriched environment, like the guy in the 1940s heard. And after 30 days, just 30 days, she dissects the brains of the mice. This is only after 30 days. 1 month. What does she discover? Well, she looks at the mice that are in the regular cage. She opens their brains. And the synapse connections, which are very important connections to the neurons, as well as the cortex over top of the brains, they don't change from the mice that, were the test case in the regular cages. She looks at the mice in the enriched environments just after 30 days. And what does she discover? The synapse connections between these neurons, after 30 days, they grow at a rate of 25% more than the ones that were in the regular cage. And in fact, the cortex begins to thicken also at a significant rate, which is very important in problem solving. What happens to the poor little mice that are in the impoverished environments? In fact, the synapses and the cortex begins to wither and shrink the same way as a plant does without getting water or sunshine.
Wow.
So the question is, what's the relevance to that, to the environments of which we live, where we work, where we heal, where we learn, where we play as a result of the environment? And so this area of study and research clearly isn't something that's very casual and something that we say, oh, well, I feel better in the environment. In fact, it changes the biology and physiology of the brain. And a severe example of it, a very important case that went to the Supreme Court in the United States, these three guys called the Angola Three. And they were each in solitary confinement from somewhere from 12 to 15 to just shy of 30 years.
Wow.
Robert King was in solitary confinement for 29 years. He was in a windowless room for all but 1 hour a day. It goes to the Supreme Court, and they had to prove that it was cruel, unusual punishment. And the way they had to prove it was that it changes your biology. And they discovered that the hippocampus at the bottom of the brain, very important for spatial orientation, memory, social interaction, again, like the little mice in the lab cages, in fact, they proved that it damaged his brain. And so that's, quite a severe example of it. But this study of environmental enrichment, the intersection of the cognitive sciences, neuroscience, and architecture begins to show us that our environment changes. And this last little point that I discovered while researching the book was that we spend more time inside our built environments than most whales do. Most whales spend underwater. Wow. Isn't that remarkable?
Wow.
But we know, and we're worried about all of the microplastics, all of the pollutions that we put in the water, because we're worried about the little fish and the mammals, like the whales and the dolphins that swim underwater, because we fundamentally understand that their environments have the ability to damage and kill those guys that are swimming around. But in fact, we don't think about the same way of our own environments. Yeah. And that's why this book is trying to make a very easy way for people to understand and have the tools to understand how we can create enriched environments, or like a lot of the environments where we learn and we work, in fact, are impoverished environments.
Totally agree. What do you think holds architects, designers, and urban planners back from constructing health?
Well, I think as professionals that we've been focused on only one very important, but only if I define optimal health as like a four-legged tabletop, and the table optimal health is like a vase with flowers on, and it's supported by four legs. And the table is unsteady if you take away one of the legs. But what are those legs? Well, the legs, one leg that our profession, as you know, is very much focused on, which is design's impact on ecological health. Well, that's very important. But I think it's becoming a standard of care that we firmly understand. Like a simple example is, now when you go and show your clients, say, some carpet or fabrics, when you show the carpet, you don't say, well, you want the carpet that off-gasses or the carpet that doesn't off-gas. Well, and it's because now there's very few carpets that you could get out there because we've moved and the products have moved. The second leg that's very important is design's impact on our physical health. And the physical health is Now we're seeing a lot more buildings that make it very easy for you to ambulate up and down stairs. They have daylight compared to using the elevator. Equally, we have a lot of design regulations that make it very easy for us to walk from public transportation to jumping on a bike or having, good bike paths or bike lanes on our street. So it's design's impact on our physical health, and design is coming along. We're also beginning to understand that design has a significant impact, which is the third leg, on societal health. In fact, we used to keep these people away from these people. Our profession was very good at separating and segregating people. And so we realize that now. But right now, there's this emerging area, which is only about 20 years old, which is design's impact on our mind health. And I'm using that word very specifically as opposed to mental. Mind health is focused on an asset-based view of our mind's health, as opposed to a deficit-based view, which is mental health. And don't get me wrong, I think we're very fortunate now that we're beginning to look at mental health coming out of the closet as it was before. And we're beginning to, in public policy, put the things in place to help people with mental health. And that's very significant. But that's really looking at some of the deficit-based view things of health and sort of the pathogenic side of things, where mind health is really looking at the asset-based view and how can the environments create the conditions of which you can thrive and prosper and flourish. And in fact, we've just been looking at some specific technologies on how we can map that because it's very important. So what I mean is that our profession has been focused on the first leg that's supporting that tabletop of optimal health. But if we don't have the other legs, the tabletop falls down because it's not affecting really arguably what's called planetary health or one health or a variety of those things. And in the book, I have a glossary of terms. I have a whole chapter looking at how do we define health over 3,000 years of 3,000 years of human history, for which in fact Indigenous and First Nation health, as in your country, here it's First Nations. Those views were these intersecting circles, in fact, of those four legs that support human health, and I believe it's the same in your country. So there's a glossary of terms. There's defining, and so the book is really trying to give people the tools in a very accessible and readable way. Again, it can be a textbook for students. It can be a resource for professionals. But most importantly, it's 30 centimeters square, big format, big images, and it's aimed at a coffee table book also for the general public so that we can disseminate these ideas and hopefully float everybody's boat on demanding more from the spaces we create.
Awesome. Do you have a way of measuring or collecting data that the architecture you create shows what a positive impact it is having on the health and well-being of its occupants, of where we live, work, are educated and heal?
So we're working, we do. And in fact, this morning I had a call with a body. I think they're very interesting. We're a group out of Boston. The company is called iMotion, and they have a whole range of tracking devices. And those tracking devices can be the EEG headsets that you see that begin to register your brain waves. They have skin conductance, which that if the moisture content changes on your skin, it can relate to either stress or pleasure. Eye tracking technology, which are glasses that I was just testing out 2 weeks ago in one of our buildings. They do two things. One is they map on what you're looking at. So in a lot of the spaces, we talk about variety and vitality and the sense of occurrence, or simply that idea, back to salutogenesis, a sense of coherence and comprehensibility. It shows what do you focus on the front door or the next thing that begins to lead you through the space. Very important technology. The other one is these glasses, instead of mapping on where your eye is looking at, it also maps the changes in your facial expressions. So there's, I think, about a dozen micro muscle movements on your face that track either, pleasure or fear or being scared or all the rest. And these things map that, which for me is very important. So we're beginning to use that within our buildings. But there's also other ones that map your blood pressure and your heart rate. And obviously, if your blood pressure, your heart rate is racing, it can relate to stress. But there's also one piece that's very, very important, and that's what our call was today, that we're just beginning to map because it hasn't been used in placemaking or architecture in the past. And so, what do I mean by that? So think of your heart rate. There's heart rate and there's heart rate variability. So heart rate, meaning that you're stressed out or you're in fear or you feel really very uncomfortable in an environment that you're in. That races your heart. Mm. And that shows that there is stress. But stress is both positive and negative. Negative stress, meaning that you're out on a street at night and it feels like a scary spot. Or you can think of people. Maybe let's start there. Think of being in a spot with somebody that stresses you out. We can picture those people. But think of the opposite, that you walk into a building, you turn the corner, and you just see the old love of your life that you haven't seen for 5 years. Both of those people are going to get your heart racing, one in a very bad and one in a very good way. Mm-hmm. But the good way, the second element is heart rate variability. And so what it means is that if you're stressed, your heart rate goes very quickly in a very, very regular beat. But the heart rate variability, and you just saw the love of your life, is that it races quickly, but it goes in a very minor, irregular pulse rate. And that's amazing. Well, in buildings, those stress is exactly the same. There's positive stress. If you walk into an environment that is amazing, your heart races also. But it's also, when it's at rest, there's also a heart rate variability on a positive side. And if you just think of a lot of the Fitbits or the watches, there's a new ring out, or a ring, I should say, that's been around for a while, called Aura ring, which in fact we're just getting ours. And it tracks not only your heart rate, but the heart rate variability. And so with these guys, iMotion also, that we're just laying out a study, which hasn't happened in buildings, to begin to track heart rate variability, meaning go and walk and sit in a park, then go walk on a busy street, then go walk into a sacred space, say like a church where your eyes, race up in a cathedral, and your heart starts racing because of the spiritual dimension, but then going also in a resting space. So what we want to do is begin to use this as a way to just become very, very specific on how we can create enriched environments.
Love it. My final question is, what's next for Tye and Farrow Architects?
We're just about to create this lab in partnership with these academic organizations, so that we can really dive deeper into the things that we've laid out in constructing health, the book, so that we can do it and then disseminate the information that will give us all all of us in the profession tools to really begin to understand and chart this new path forward. Because I want to connect two things that I think are very, very important. That are we are at a new paradigm, and it's a paradigm shift that we're seeing around placemaking and health. And what do I mean by evidence of that? Two things. Back in 2022, the Union International of Architecture, the UIA, the great global gathering of architects from around the world, 2022 they defined the year of health and design, which was linking placemaking, cities, buildings, about not just ecological health, but our physical and psychological health and well-being. And in the United States, the American Institute of Architects, at the recent convention, just adopted a resolution that said that the relationship between placemaking and health, physical health and psychological health, needs to be written into the American Institute of Architects code of conduct, their ethics, and their teaching. And that's a fundamental shift away from just this idea of welfare, meaning that we have to stop buildings from falling down, that we should have fire exit stairs, on and on and on. That's the pathogenic side of architecture, as opposed to the salutogenic side, which is how can we cause health. Back to the idea, it's not of what architecture is, but it's what architecture does. And in fact, the idea of intentionally causing health, salutogenic, that complicated word.
The one I find hard to pronounce. Thanks, Tye. You've been incredible. Thank you for your time and your legacy. It's wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the Felt Experience. I hope you've enjoyed the latest episode of the Felt Experience. I'm Melissa Henschke, your host. Thank you for tuning in. Please leave any queries, questions you may have on the various platforms you've tuned in through. We look forward to seeing you next time.